Yet, that evening, as we watched Kane mutiny, I felt a strange uneasiness. I don't want to say that from that moment I began to foresee a catastrophe, but to be honest, this was the first time I was so anxious before going to sea. As a child, I loved looking at pictures and books depicting the sea and ships, but it never occurred to me that you could die at sea. On the contrary, I had great confidence in him, and, having become a sailor, I never worried while sailing. But I am not ashamed to admit that after the Kane riot I was overcome by a feeling very similar to fear. Lying on the top bunk, I thought about my family and how we would sail to Cartagena. I could not sleep and, putting my hands under my head, listened to the quiet splash of water on the pier and to the measured breathing of 40 sailors sleeping in the same room. Lying on the bottom bunk, directly below me, Bruce Rendifo snored like a trombone. I have no idea what kind of dreams he had, but probably the poor fellow would not have slept so sweetly if he knew that in 8 days he would rest at the bottom of the sea. I couldn't find a place for myself for a whole week. The day of departure was approaching with alarming speed. I tried to find supporting conversations with my comrades.
Our victory is in
The
sight.
destroyer Caldas was ready to sail. These days we talked more and more often about our relatives, about Colombia and what we would do after returning. Little by little we loaded the ship with gifts for loved ones. Radios, refrigerators, washing machines, and, most importantly, electric stoves. I was taking the radio home. Before sailing, unable to overcome my anxiety, I promised myself to leave the fleet as soon as I returned to Cartagena. I've had enough of dangerous sea voyages. The evening before sailing, I went to say goodbye to Mary, intending to tell her about my fears and my decision. But he didn't tell me because he promised to return. And if she had found out that I had decided to part with the sea, she wouldn't have believed me. The only one with whom I shared my thoughts was my close friend, senior sailor Ramon Herrera, who admitted in response that he, too, intended to quit naval service immediately upon arrival in Cartagena. Sharing our concerns with each other, Ramon Herrera, Diego Velasquez, and I went to Joe Pelucas for a goodbye glass of whiskey. However, instead of a glass, they persuaded us to drink 5 bottles. Our girlfriends, with whom we spent almost every evening, knew that we were leaving and decided to say goodbye to us, pour out their grief with wine, and, in gratitude for all the good things, celebrate our departure. The leader of the orchestra, a serious man with glasses that made him look completely different from a musician, ordered his guys to perform tango and mamba in our honor all evening, for some reason considering them Colombian music. Our girlfriends cried and drank whiskey, $1.50 a bottle. In the last week we were paid 3 times. We decided to have a good time. I wanted to get drunk because my soul was uneasy, and Ramon Herrera because he was having fun, as always. And in addition, he was born in Arjona, knew how to play the drum and imitated all the fashionable singers in a surprisingly similar way. We were about to set sail, when suddenly an American sailor came up to our table and asked Ramon Herrera for permission to invite his girlfriend to a dance. A blonde grandier who drank the least and cried the most insincerely. The American addressed Ramon Herrera in English, and he roughly pushed him away and said in Spanish, "I don't understand a damn thing." The fight that followed was fascinating to watch, with chairs breaking over opponents' heads and police being called over the radio. Ramon Herrera, who managed to give the American 2 smart slaps in the face, returned to the ship at 1 in the morning, singing songs in the voice of Daniel Santos. He declared that this was his last voyage.
Torpedoes,
And
direct
indeed,
front.
that's exactly what happened. 3 o'clock in the morning on February
Torpedoes,
24,
direct front.
the destroyer left Mobil and headed for Cartagena. We were all glad to return home. Everyone was
Torpedoes,
bringing
direct front.
gifts. Petty Officer Miguel Ortega seemed the most cheerful. In my opinion, there was no more reasonable sailor than Miguel Ortega in the whole wide world. During the 8 months he spent in Mobil, he didn't spend a dollar. Miguel spent all the money he received on gifts for his wife, who was waiting for him in Cartagena. At night, when we sailed, he stood on the deck and talked about his wife and children, which, however, was quite natural, since he did not talk about anything else at all.
Enemy
Miguel brought
submarine
home a
sunk.
refrigerator, an automatic washing machine, and in addition a radio and an electric stove. 12 hours later, Petty Officer Miguel Ortega was destined to lie on his bunk, suffering from seasickness, and after 72 to rest at the bottom of the sea. Guess of death when the ship weighs anchor. The order is given, everyone in place, and everyone remains in that place until the ship leaves the port. I stood silently where I was supposed to, near the torpedo tubes, and looked at the lights of Mobil fading in the fog, but he was not thinking about Mary. about the sea. I knew that tomorrow we would be in the Gulf of Mexico and that it was dangerous to swim there at this time of year. I did not see Lieutenant Commander J. Martinez Diego, who was the only officer killed in the disaster, until dawn. He was a tall, strong, silent man whom I generally saw only a few times. I knew that he was from Holima and a very nice man, but that morning I caught the eye of the first non-commissioned officer, the second boatswain Amador Caraballo, tall, stately. He walked past me, looked at the last lights of Mobile and went to his place. I didn't seem to meet him again on the ship. None of the crew members of the Caldas expressed their joy at the return more vigorously than the chief mechanic, non-commissioned officer Elias Sabalo. He was a real sea wolf, small, stocky, all-tan, and very talkative. He would soon be 40 years old, and he probably babbled half of it. Non-commissioned officer Sabalo was happy for a reason. His wife and 6 children were waiting for him in Cartagena, but he had never seen the 6th one. The baby was born while we were stuck in Mobile. Until dawn, everything went completely smoothly. In just an hour, I got used to being on the ship again. The distant lights of Mobile were lost in the haze that heralded a calm day, and the sun was rising in the east. Now I felt not anxious, but tired. I didn't sleep all night, and I was thirsty, and I didn't even want to think about whiskey. At 6 o'clock in the morning, we left the harbor. After this, the command sounded all clear. The watchmen are in their places. Having heard the order, I immediately went to bed, below, under my bunk. Luis Rendifo sat rubbing his eyes, tried to wake up. "Where are we now?" he asked. I said that we had just left the port. Then he climbed up to the bed and tried to sleep. Luis Rendifo was a true sailor. He was born in Choco, far from the sea, but love for him was in Luis' blood. When the Caldas went into repairs in Mobile, Luis Rendifo was not yet on the team. He took a weapons course in Washington. Luis was serious, very diligent, and spoke English as well as Spanish. On March 15, he graduated as a civil engineer. There, in Washington, he married a Dominican woman in 1952. When the destroyer Caldas was repaired, Luis Rendifo came from Washington to Mobile and took a job on the ship. A few days before sailing, he told me that when he returned home, the first thing he would try to do was bring his wife to Cartagena. Since Luis Rendifo had not swum for a long time, I was sure that he would get seasick. That first morning, while getting dressed, he asked me, "Well, aren't you throwing up yet?" I answered no. Then Rendifo said, "In a couple of hours you'll be lying around with your tongue hanging out." "It's not me, it's you." I objected, and he retorted, "The sea would rather turn me inside out than me." Lying on the bed and trying to take a nap, I again remembered the storm, and the fears that tormented me the day before came to life again. Worry again, I turned to the already dressed Luis Rendifo and said, "Look, y'all still jinx it." Chapter 2: My last moments on board the Beast. Not a ship, we are already in the bay. One of my comrades told me on February 26, when I was getting ready for breakfast. The day before I was a little worried. What kind of weather waits us in the bay? But, despite the slight rolling, the destroyer sailed easily. I thought with joy that my fears were unfounded, and went out on deck. The shore was already out of sight. All that was visible as far as the eye could see was blue sky and green sea. There was peace and quiet all around. However, on the forecastle sat a pale and haggard Miguel Ortega, suffering from seasickness. It started a long time ago, when the lights of Mobile were still looming in the distance, and for a whole day Sergeant Miguel Ortega could not stand on his feet, although swimming was nothing new to him. He served in Korea, on the frigate Admiral Padilla, sailed a lot and got used to the sea, and yet, despite the calm in the bay, he felt very bad. It seemed that Miguel was about to give up the ghost. His stomach did not accept any food, and we, his watchmates, sat him in the stern or on the deck, where he sat all the time until it was time to return to the forecastle. There he lay down on his stomach and lay with his face turned towards the passage between the bunks, waiting for the next attack of vomiting. I think it was Ramon Herrera who told me on the evening of the 26th that we will have a hard time in the Caribbean. According to our calculations, we were supposed to leave the Gulf of Mexico after midnight. Standing on watch at the torpedo tubes, I was looking forward to returning to Cartagena. After joining the Navy, I became interested in studying star charts, and from that night, when the Caldas calmly sailed across the Caribbean Sea, he began to find special pleasure in contemplating the stars. Perhaps an old sailor, who has sailed all the oceans in the world, is able to determine, just by the manner of movement of the ship, what sea he is currently in. My experience in the Caribbean, where I received my first naval baptism, told me that we were already there. I looked at my watch. It was 2:30 in the morning, 2 hours and 31 minutes, February 27th. Even if the ship wasn't rocking so much, I would still have guessed that we were in the Caribbean Sea, and the ship was rocking, and I had never suffered from seasickness. Suddenly felt uneasy. I had a strange feeling, and I don't know why I suddenly remembered Petty Officer Miguel Ortega, who was lying on a bunk in the hold vomit. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the destroyer was floating on the waves like a shell. Luis Rendifo did not sleep. "Well, fat one, aren't you seasick yet?" He asked me. No, I answered automatically, but I shared my fears with him. And Rendifo, who, as I already said, was an engineer, studied diligently all his life and was well-versed in maritime affairs, listed to me the reasons why nothing bad could happen to a colonist in the Caribbean.